In the bronze-touched waters of the Aegean Sea, where ancient currents carried the dreams of civilizations, there lived a time when gods walked among mortals and heroes shaped the very fabric of legend. The Mediterranean world of the 8th century before our era was a realm of island kingdoms and sea-swept shores, where the echoes of a great war still whispered across the wine-dark waters. It was here, in this world of olive groves and marble temples, that the greatest tale of homecoming ever told would unfold. A story that began not with departure, but with the terrible price of victory. The city of Troy had fallen. After 10 long years of siege, the mighty walls that had withstood countless assaults lay broken, their stones scattered like the dreams of those who had defended them. The wooden horse, that masterpiece of cunning warfare, had delivered the final blow to Priam's kingdom. As dawn broke over the smouldering ruins, the Greek forces prepared for their long-awaited return to their homeland. Yet among all the warriors who had fought beneath the walls of Troy, none would face a journey more perilous, more wondrous, or more transformative than Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Odysseus, whose name would become synonymous with both cleverness and wandering, ruled over a small but prosperous island kingdom in the Ionian Sea. His realm was modest compared to the great powers of Mycenae or Sparta, yet his reputation for wisdom and cunning had made him one of the most valued counselors among the Greek alliance. It was Odysseus who had devised the stratagem of the wooden horse, bringing the long war to its decisive end. Now, as he stood upon the Trojan shore with his 12 black ships and loyal companions, he could not have imagined that his journey home would become an Odyssey lasting 10 more years, testing not only his courage and wit, but the very foundations of his identity. As you settle deeper into rest, let your mind drift to that ancient harbor where Odysseus first set sail from Troy. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the salt spray of the restless sea. His ships were laden with treasure, gold and silver taken from the fallen city, payment for years of sacrifice and loss. His men, weathered veterans of the Great War, trusted their king's judgment implicitly. They had followed him through countless battles, and they would follow him now across the wine-dark sea toward home, and the families they had left behind. The early days of the voyage passed without incident. Fair winds filled their sails as they traveled northwest across the Aegean, past islands whose names would become legendary in their own right. The men spoke of their wives and children, of the olive harvest they hoped to see, of the simple pleasures of peaceful life they had dreamed of during the long siege. Odysseus himself thought often of his beloved wife Penelope and his young son Telemachus, whom he had left as an infant. 20 years had passed since he first departed for Troy, 10 years of war followed by what should have been a brief journey home. But the gods, as mortals learn to their cost, have their own designs upon the affairs of men. Poseidon, the Earthshaker, lord of the seas and brother to Zeus himself, harbored a deep grudge against the clever king of Ithaca, for it was Odysseus who would soon blind Polyphemus, the Cyclops, who was Poseidon's son. Though this deed lay yet in the future, the threads of fate were already weaving the pattern of the hero's trials. The sea god's wrath would transform what should have been a journey of weeks into an odyssey of decades, testing every aspect of Odysseus's character and forcing him to discover strengths he never knew he possessed. The first test came as the fleet sailed past the southern coast of Thrace, where the winds died to nothing and an eerie calm settled over the water. The sea became like polished bronze, reflecting the endless dome of sky until it seemed the ships floated in a void between earth and heaven. For 3 days, they drifted in this unnatural stillness, their provisions dwindling and their water growing stale. The men began to murmur of ill omens and divine displeasure, but Odysseus maintained his composure, studying the stars and consulting the auguries. On the 4th day, a wind arose from the north. but not the gentle breeze they had hoped for. Instead, a fierce gale swept down from the mountains of Thrace, driving the ship southward at tremendous speed. The crews fought to maintain control as their vessels were tossed like leaves upon the storm-dark waters. Odysseus stood at the prow of his flagship, his hands gripping the rail as he watched his carefully planned course dissolve into chaos. The familiar constellations that had guided him were obscured by racing clouds, and when the storm finally abated, they found themselves in waters none of them recognized. As the night settles around you and your breathing grows deeper, imagine those ancient mariners as they peered into the misty dawn, trying to discern their location. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface broken only by the occasional flight of seabirds, whose cries seemed to mock their predicament. Islands appeared and disappeared in the shifting haze, their outlines suggesting lands that existed more in dream than reality. This was no ordinary corner of the Mediterranean they had entered, but a realm where the boundaries between the mortal world and the domain of gods grew thin. Their first landfall came at an island whose very name would become synonymous with temptation and forgetfulness. The coast appeared welcoming, a crescent of white sand beaches backed by gentle hills covered in unfamiliar flowering plants. As the ships approached, they could see groves of trees bearing fruit unlike any they had ever seen, and streams of clear water flowing down to the sea. After days of storm and uncertainty, the island seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. The land was inhabited by a peaceful people who called themselves the Lotus Eaters. They were a gentle folk, unhurried in their movements and dreamy in their expressions, who welcomed the Greek visitors with generous hospitality. They offered no weapons or challenge, but instead invited the strangers to share in their simple feast. The centerpiece of their meal was the fruit of the lotus plant, sweet, fragrant flowers that grew in abundance throughout their island paradise. Odysseus, ever cautious, remained with the ships while he sent 3 of his most trusted scouts to explore the island and make contact with its inhabitants. The men who ventured inland found a people living in what seemed to be perfect contentment. There were no signs of want or strife, no evidence of the struggle and hardship that marked life in the broader world. The Lotus Eaters moved through their days in a kind of blissful trance, concerned with nothing beyond the immediate pleasure of their existence. The fruit they offered was unlike anything the Greeks had ever tasted. It was sweeter than honey, more refreshing than wine, and filled with a subtle power that gradually spread through the body and mind of those who consumed it. The 3 scouts, hungry after their long voyage, ate gratefully of this strange delicacy. At first, they felt only a pleasant drowsiness, a sense of peace that seemed to flow through their very bones. The constant vigilance that had marked their years as warriors began to fade, replaced by a dreamlike acceptance of whatever might come. As you drift deeper into your own rest, consider the profound appeal of such a place. A land where all struggle ceases, where the weight of memory and ambition falls away like a discarded cloak. The Lotus Eaters had found a kind of paradise, but it was a paradise purchased at the price of growth, of change, of the very qualities that make life meaningful. For as the hours passed, the 3 Greek scouts began to lose all desire to return to their ships. The thought of continuing their journey home grew dim and distant, like a half-remembered dream from another life. When evening came and the scouts had not returned, Odysseus grew concerned. The island showed no signs of danger, no smoke from signal fires, no sounds of battle, no cries for help. Yet something in the very peace of the place troubled the experienced king. He had learned during his years at Troy that the most dangerous enemies were often those who appeared most benign. Taking a small party of his most loyal men, he ventured inland to find his missing scouts. He found them in a grove of lotus trees, reclining in the shade with several of the island's inhabitants. Their weapons lay forgotten beside them. Their eyes held the same dreamy contentment that marked the Lotus Eaters. When Odysseus called to them, they looked up with mild interest, but showed no inclination to rise. The urgency of their mission, the families waiting for them in Ithaca, the very memory of who they were and what they had fought for, all of this had been gently dissolved by the power of the lotus fruit. "Come," Odysseus commanded, but his men shook their heads with serene smiles. They spoke of the beauty of the island, the kindness of its people, the perfect peace they had found. Why return to a world of struggle and sorrow when such contentment was available here? Their words were reasonable, their voices calm, but Odysseus recognized the danger they represented. This was not peace, but oblivion, not rest, but a kind of living death. With characteristic decisiveness, Odysseus ordered his loyal men to bind the 3 scouts and carry them back to the ships. The affected men protested weakly, but offered no real resistance, their will sapped by the lotus fruit's power. Only when they were well out to sea, with the island fading into the distance behind them, did the influence of the plant begin to fade. Gradually, like men awakening from a profound dream, they remembered who they were and where they were bound. The encounter with the Lotus Eaters would remain with Odysseus throughout his long journey, a reminder of how easily the human spirit could be seduced into abandoning its purpose. It was the first of many tests he would face, each one designed to strip away another layer of his identity until only the essential core remained. As the ships continued their wandering course across the wine-dark sea, the king of Ithaca began to understand that his journey home would require not just physical courage, but a constant vigilance over his own soul. The next trial awaited them on an island that rose from the sea like a fortress of living stone. The coast was ringed with cliffs so sheer that landing seemed impossible, but as they sailed around the island's perimeter, they discovered a narrow harbour hidden in a fold of the rocks. The entrance was barely wide enough for a single ship, and the harbour itself was little more than a circular pool surrounded by towering walls of stone. It was a perfect natural stronghold, but as they anchored their vessels in the still water, an ominous silence settled over the place. The island above them showed signs of habitation, smoke rising from what appeared to be a massive cave opening, and the sound of something large moving about in the shadows. Odysseus, displaying the boldness that had made him legendary among the Greeks, decided to explore this mysterious place personally. Taking 12 of his bravest companions, he climbed the steep path that led from the harbour to the cave entrance, carrying with them a skin of the finest wine as a gift for whatever inhabitant they might encounter. The cave they entered was unlike any dwelling they had ever seen. It was vast, large enough to house a dozen ordinary homes, and clearly served as both residence and workshop for its occupant. Massive stone implements lay scattered about, sized for hands, far larger than any mortals. Pens constructed of enormous boulders held flocks of sheep and goats, each animal larger and finer than any they had seen in Greece. Wheels of cheese, each one as large as a chariot wheel, hung aging from the rocky ceiling. Everything about the place spoke of a being of immense size and strength. As the night deepens around you and your mind begins to wander towards sleep, picture those 13 men as they explored that cavernous dwelling. The very scale of everything they saw must have filled them with a mixture of wonder and unease. They were no cowards. These were men who had fought beneath the walls of Troy, who had faced the bronze-tipped spears of Hector's warriors without flinching. Yet the implications of what they saw in that cave went beyond ordinary danger into realms where mortal strength and courage might prove inadequate. The owner of the cave was Polyphemus, one of the race of cyclopes, giants born from the union of earth and sky in the earliest days of the world. Unlike his brothers who served as smiths to the gods, forging thunderbolts for Zeus and armor for the immortals, Polyphemus lived as a shepherd. tending his flocks in solitude on this remote island. He was a creature of immense physical power but limited intelligence, possessed of a single enormous eye in the center of his forehead and a disposition that was both childlike and savage. When Polyphemus returned to his cave that evening, driving his massive flocks before him, he discovered the Greeks huddled in the shadows near his hearth. The sight of these tiny intruders in his domain filled him with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. He was not entirely without courtesy. He inquired about their names and purpose, speaking in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder through the stone chamber. But when Odysseus attempted to invoke the sacred laws of hospitality, offering gifts and requesting safe passage, the Cyclops laughed with a sound like grinding boulders. Polyphemus cared nothing for the customs that governed civilized society. The gods who enforced these laws meant little to one who was himself descended from the primordial powers of earth and sky. With casual cruelty, he seized two of Odysseus's companions and dashed their brains out against the stone wall, then devoured their bodies while the surviving Greeks watched in horror. Having satisfied his immediate hunger, he sealed the cave entrance with a massive stone that would have required the strength of 20 men to move, ensuring that his remaining captives could not escape during the night. The situation seemed hopeless. They were trapped in the cave with a monster who clearly intended to consume them one by one. The Cyclops was far too strong to defeat in direct combat, and even if they could somehow kill him, they would remain sealed in the cave, to die of thirst and starvation. It was then that Odysseus began to display the quality that would see him through all his trials, the ability to find cleverness where others saw only despair. As you allow your thoughts to become as fluid as the wine-dark sea, consider the king of Ithaca as he lay awake in that terrible cave, listening to the breathing of the giant who held their lives in his massive hands. In the depths of apparent defeat, Odysseus began to weave the threads of a plan that would require not just intelligence, but perfect timing and nerves of steel. He had noticed that Polyphemus, despite his strength, relied heavily on his single eye. More importantly, he had observed the Cyclops' fondness for wine and his relative inexperience with the refined beverages of civilization. The next morning brought fresh horror as Polyphemus consumed 2 more of the Greeks before departing with his flocks. But it also brought opportunity, for the giant's routine was now established. Odysseus spent the day preparing his stratagem, working with his surviving men to sharpen one end of a massive wooden staff they found in the cave. They hardened the point in the coals of the Cyclops' fire and concealed their work behind the massive cheese wheels hanging from the ceiling. When Polyphemus returned that evening, Odysseus was ready with the first phase of his plan. He approached the giant with apparent submission, offering him the skin of precious wine they had brought from the ships. The wine was of exceptional quality, far superior to anything the isolated Cyclops had ever tasted. Polyphemus drank deeply, his savage nature temporarily mellowed by the alcohol's influence. He demanded more wine, and more again, until his speech began to slur and his movements became clumsy. In this state of inebriation, the Cyclops became almost jovial, promising Odysseus that he would be eaten last as a reward for providing such excellent drink. When Polyphemus asked for his benefactor's name, Odysseus replied with characteristic cunning, "My name is Nobody. Nobody is what my mother and father call me, and all my friends as well." The giant laughed at this strange appellation and promised that Nobody would indeed be his final meal. The wine's effects proved even more potent than Odysseus had hoped. Before long, Polyphemus collapsed into a drunken stupor. His massive body sprawled across the cave floor, his snores echoing like thunder through the stone chamber. It was then that Odysseus and his men put their desperate plan into action. They took the sharpened staff, heated its point until it glowed red hot in the coals, then drove it deep into the Cyclops' single eye. The giant's screams of pain and rage shook the very foundations of the island. He clawed at his destroyed eye, rolling about the cave in agony while the Greeks pressed themselves against the walls to avoid being crushed by his thrashing limbs. His cries brought other cyclopes from neighboring islands, and they gathered outside the sealed cave entrance, calling out to inquire about their brother's distress. "What ails you, Polyphemus?" they shouted. "Why do you cry out so in the night? Is someone stealing your flocks? Is someone trying to kill you?" Still writhing in pain, Polyphemus called back through the stone barrier, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is stealing my flocks. Nobody has blinded me." His fellow Cyclopes, hearing this response, concluded that he was either dreaming or suffering from some divine affliction beyond their ability to help. "If nobody is troubling you," they replied, "then there is nothing we can do. Pray to your father Poseidon for healing." With that, they departed, leaving Polyphemus alone with his agony and his captives. As the gentle rhythms of sleep begin to claim your consciousness, picture the scene that followed. The blinded giant, mad with pain and fury, removed the stone from the cave entrance and sat in the opening, his hands extended to catch any who might try to escape. He knew the Greeks were still trapped within, and he was determined that none would leave alive. For their part, Odysseus and his men found themselves in a predicament nearly as dangerous as before. They could see freedom beyond the cave mouth, but the Cyclops' massive form blocked their path as effectively as the stone had done. Once again, it was Odysseus' ingenuity that provided salvation. He had noticed that each morning, Polyphemus' sheep and goats would leave the cave to graze on the island's sparse vegetation. The animals were large creatures, their thick fleeces providing ample concealment. Working quietly through the night, Odysseus and his men lashed themselves beneath the largest rams, clinging to the thick wool on their bellies as the animals prepared for their morning journey to pasture. When dawn came, the flock began to move toward the cave entrance, as was their custom. Polyphemus, still guarding the opening, ran his hands over each animal as it passed, checking for any human presence. But his attention was focused on the animals' backs and sides. He never thought to examine their undersides, where the Greeks hung suspended by nothing more than their grip on the thick fleece. Odysseus had chosen for himself the finest ram in the flock, a magnificent creature whose wool was particularly dense. As this animal approached the cave mouth, Polyphemus paused, recognizing his favorite by touch. He spoke to the ram with surprising tenderness, wondering why it was moving so slowly when usually it led the flock to pasture. The irony was not lost on Odysseus. Suspended beneath the very animal the giant was addressing, the ram was indeed carrying a greater burden than usual, though not the kind Polyphemus imagined. One by one, the surviving Greeks passed through the cave entrance to freedom, still clinging to their woolly conveyances. Only when they were well away from the cave did they drop to the ground and reveal themselves. They quickly drove the finest of the sheep toward their ships, for the animals represented not only food for their journey, but also a form of compensation for their slain companions. But Odysseus, in a moment that revealed both his pride and his humanity, could not resist revealing his true identity to the defeated giant. From the safety of his ship, as his men prepared to depart, he called back to the shore where Polyphemus stood, listening for any sound that might betray his enemy's location. "Cyclops!" Odysseus shouted across the water. "If anyone asks who put out your eye, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." It was a declaration born of justified pride, but one that would cost him dearly. For Polyphemus, learning at last the true name of his tormentor, raised his hands to the heavens and called upon his father, Poseidon, lord of the sea and earth-shaker, to avenge his injury. The prayer that rose from that rocky shore would echo across the years of Odysseus' wandering, for Poseidon heard his son's plea and answered it with a curse that would keep the hero from his homeland for 10 long years. As the ships departed from the Cyclops' island, the crew was in high spirits despite their losses. They had escaped from what seemed certain death, outwitted a monster, and gained a fine flock of sheep in the bargain. The wine-dark sea stretched before them, and home seemed within reach once more. They could not know that their troubles were only beginning, that the god of the sea was even now stirring the waters against them. The next phase of their journey brought them to Aeolia, the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. This was a realm unlike any mortal land, an island that drifted across the sea according to the will of its divine inhabitant, its shores enclosed by a wall of unbreakable bronze. Aeolus himself was a figure of immense power, appointed by Zeus to govern the winds that swept across the earth and sea. He ruled from a magnificent palace, where his 6 sons were wed to his 6 daughters, and eternal feasting and music filled the halls. The Wind Lord received Odysseus with great courtesy, for the fame of the hero's exploits at Troy had reached even this remote realm. For a full month, Aeolus entertained his guests with the finest hospitality, listening with delight to Odysseus's account of the war and his adventures since departing from Troy's burning shores. The king of Ithaca spoke of the wooden horse, of the heroes who had fought and died, of his longing to see his wife and son again. Moved by this tale of separation and wandering, Aeolus decided to grant Odysseus a gift that would ensure his swift return to Ithaca. He took a bag made from the hide of a 9-year-old ox and trapped within it all the winds that might blow his ships away from their destined course. Only the gentle west wind, which would carry them directly home, was left free to fill their sails. The bag was sealed with silver wire that could not be broken, and Aeolus warned Odysseus that under no circumstances should it be opened until he had reached his native shore. With this precious cargo safely stowed aboard his flagship, Odysseus set sail with renewed hope. The west wind bore them swiftly across the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, and for 9 days and nights their progress was swift and sure. The hero himself remained constantly vigilant, never allowing the bag out of his sight, steering the ship with his own hands while his men took their rest. Sleep seemed a small price to pay for the promise of reaching home at last. As you rest deeper in your own peaceful repose, imagine those 9 days of perfect sailing, when every league covered brought the wandering king closer to his beloved Ithaca. The stars wheeled overhead in their appointed courses, the sea lay calm beneath a steady breeze, and for the first time since leaving Troy, Odysseus allowed himself to believe that his trials might be nearing their end. He could almost see the familiar cliffs of his island home rising from the wine-dark waters, almost smell the olive groves where he had played as a child. On the 10th day, the coast of Ithaca appeared on the horizon. The sight of their homeland after so many years of war and wandering filled the crew with joy, and they called out to each other, pointing to familiar landmarks. Odysseus, exhausted from his long vigil, finally allowed himself to rest. As the ship drew near to the harbour, he knew so well, he fell into a deep sleep, trusting that his men would handle the final approach to shore. It was then that curiosity and greed combined to undo all of Aeolus's generous gift. The crew had watched their king guard the mysterious bag with such care that they had begun to speculate about its contents. Surely, they reasoned, it must contain treasures from their host, gold and silver that Odysseus was keeping for himself rather than sharing with his loyal companions. While their leader slept, they decided to see what wealth he had hidden from them. The moment the silver wire was cut, disaster struck. All the imprisoned winds burst forth at once in a howling tempest that seized the ships and hurled them back across the sea they had so carefully traversed. Odysseus awoke to find his vessel spinning like a leaf in a whirlwind, his homeland already vanishing into the distance behind them. The anguish in his heart was so great that he considered throwing himself into the churning waters, ending his sufferings once and for all. But the thought of his wife and son, still waiting for his return, stayed his hand. The winds drove them back to Aeolia, where they once again approached the bronze-walled shores of the floating island. But when Odysseus pleaded with Aeolus for another chance, for a second gift of favorable winds, the Windlord refused with cold finality. The gods, he declared, had clearly marked Odysseus as one they wished to suffer. No mortal, however well-intentioned, should interfere with divine will. The ships were dismissed from Aeolia with no assistance, left to find their own way across the trackless sea. What followed was a period of rowing, 6 days of back-breaking labor as the crews struggled to make progress against contrary winds and hostile currents. Their provisions were running low, their water was becoming stale, and morale had plummeted to dangerous levels. The men who had once followed Odysseus with unquestioning loyalty now whispered among themselves about the curses that seemed to follow their king. Some began to speak of mutiny, of choosing a new leader who might prove more favored by the gods. It was in this state of desperation that they sighted their next landfall, a harbor that seemed to promise shelter and respite from their struggles. The coast appeared welcoming, with a narrow entrance opening into a broad bay surrounded by towering cliffs. It reminded them somewhat of the Cyclops' harbor, but the presence of what appeared to be a substantial city gave them hope that they would find civilized inhabitants rather than monsters. The city was indeed inhabited, but by beings that proved even more dangerous than Polyphemus in their malevolent intelligence. These were the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants who had learned to use their fearsome nature for organized predation. They maintained the appearance of a normal city to lure unsuspecting travelers into their carefully prepared trap, then fell upon their victims with coordinated savagery. As the night deepens around you and sleep begins to claim your thoughts, consider the terrible cunning of this place. Unlike the Cyclops, who was dangerous but essentially simple in his brutality, the Laestrygonians had created an entire civilization based on predation. Their harbor was designed as a trap, their city laid out to prevent escape, their very society organized around the systematic destruction of anyone unfortunate enough to enter their domain. Odysseus, ever cautious, moored his own ship outside the narrow harbor entrance, while the other 11 vessels entered the bay and anchored in what appeared to be safety. He sent 3 men to explore the city and make contact with its rulers, following the established protocols of ancient diplomacy. What they found was a place of horror disguised as hospitality. The scouts were taken to the palace of the Laestrygonian king, where they met his queen, a woman of such enormous size that her very appearance filled them with dread. She summoned her husband, who proved even more gigantic and terrifying than herself. The king's response to the arrival of strangers was not the courteous welcome required by the laws of hospitality, but an immediate attempt to seize one of the scouts for his dinner. The 2 surviving messengers fled in terror back toward the harbor, but their escape only served to alert the entire city to the presence of prey. The Laestrygonians poured from their houses in a mob of howling giants, each one eager to claim a share of the unexpected feast. They stationed themselves on the cliffs surrounding the harbor and began hurling massive boulders down at the trapped ships below. The slaughter that followed was swift and terrible. The 11 ships anchored in the bay were crushed like eggshells beneath the rain of stones, their crews either killed instantly or left struggling in the water to be speared like fish by the giants' massive weapons. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of brave men who had survived the siege of Troy met their end in that cursed harbor, their blood staining the wine-dark waters red. Only Odysseus and the crew of his single ship escaped the massacre, and only because he had maintained his position outside the harbor mouth. As soon as he saw the attack begin, he ordered his men to cut their anchor cable and row with all their strength toward the open sea. The Laestrygonians hurled stones after them, but the range was too great, and the lone ship escaped into the safety of deeper waters. The loss was catastrophic. In a single afternoon, Odysseus had gone from commanding a fleet of 12 ships with several hundred loyal followers to being the sole survivor of his proud squadron. The weight of responsibility for so many deaths pressed upon him, like the stones the giants had hurled at his companions. Yet even in the depths of his grief, he could not allow despair to overcome him. One ship remained, and with it, the hope of eventual return to Ithaca. As you drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, let your mind follow that solitary vessel as it sailed away from the scene of tragedy. The survivors sat in stunned silence, still hardly able to believe the swiftness with which disaster had overtaken them. They were now alone on the vast sea, with no other ships to provide support or companionship. Every decision would have to be made with the knowledge that no help would come if they chose wrongly. Their next landfall came at an island that seemed to promise a return to the mystical, rather than the brutally physical dangers they had recently faced. This was Aeaea, home of the divine sorceress Circe, daughter of Helios the sun god, and sister to the king of Colchis. The island was densely forested and seemingly uninhabited, but smoke rising from its interior suggested the presence of at least one dwelling. Circe was a figure of immense power and ancient wisdom, one of the minor goddesses who had chosen to dwell apart from both Olympus and the mortal world. Her magic was of the oldest kind, transformative power that could reshape the very essence of living beings. She lived in a magnificent palace, hidden deep in the island's heart, surrounded by creatures that had once been men, but now served her in animal form. When Odysseus and his men drew their ship up on the beach, they were torn between the need to find food and shelter and the well-founded fear of what new dangers might await them. The king of Ithaca decided to divide his remaining followers into two groups. He would lead one party, while his trusted lieutenant Eurylochus commanded the other. They would draw lots to determine which group would explore the island's interior, while the other remained to guard the ship. The lot fell to Eurylochus, who set off with 22 men toward the source of the smoke they had observed. Their path led through ancient forests, where oak and pine grew to enormous size, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the sun's light barely reached the forest floor. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, not the normal calls of wild animals, but something that suggested intelligence trapped in bestial form. They found Circe's palace in a clearing where the sunlight fell like golden wine through the emerald leaves. The building itself was magnificent, constructed of white marble and surrounded by gardens where exotic flowers bloomed in impossible profusion. But most unsettling were the creatures that moved through these gardens. Wolves and lions that showed no fear of the approaching men, that looked upon them with eyes too intelligent for mere beasts. From within the palace came the sound of singing, a voice of such beauty that it seemed to weave spells in the very air. The melody was hypnotic, drawing the men forward despite their instinctive caution. When they called out, announcing their presence and requesting hospitality, the singing stopped, and moments later, the palace doors opened to reveal Circe herself. The goddess appeared in the form of a mortal woman, but one of such transcendent beauty that her divine nature was unmistakable. Her hair flowed like liquid gold, her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect all the wisdom of the ages, and her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonies that no mortal throat could produce. She welcomed the strangers with gracious words, inviting them to enter her palace and share in her hospitality. The interior of her dwelling was even more magnificent than its exterior suggested. The floors were inlaid with precious stones that formed intricate patterns. The walls were adorned with tapestries that seemed to move and change as they were observed, and the air itself was perfumed with scents that stirred memories of homes and loved ones long unseen. Circe led her guests to a great hall where a feast had been prepared, or perhaps conjured with food and wine of extraordinary quality. As the night continues to enfold you in its gentle embrace, imagine those weary travelers as they sat in that magical hall, surrounded by luxury beyond their wildest dreams. After the horrors they had endured and the hardships of their long voyage, Circe's hospitality seemed like a return to the golden age of heroes. The wine was sweeter than nectar, the food more satisfying than any meal they had ever tasted, and their beautiful hostess attended to their every need with divine grace. But Circe's gifts came with a price that none of them suspected. Into the wine she had mixed a potion of her own devising, a magical compound that would strip away their human nature and reduce them to the level of beasts. As the men drank deeply of her seemingly generous offering, they felt a strange drowsiness creeping over them, followed by sensations they could not understand. The transformation began subtly, a coarsening of their features, a thickening of their limbs, a dulling of their thoughts. Their speech became slurred, then degraded into grunts and squeals. Hair sprouted from their bodies, their spines curved, their hands became hooves. Within minutes, the 22 warriors who had entered Circe's palace as men had been reduced to swine, retaining only their human memories to make their degradation complete. Circe drove them with her golden wand into pens behind her palace, where they joined the other creatures that had once been men, victims of previous visitors who had accepted the sorceress's treacherous hospitality. Yet even in their bestial forms, they retained their human consciousness, making their fate all the more terrible. They could remember their families, their hopes, their very names, but they could no longer speak or act upon these memories. Only Eurylochus escaped this fate, for he had remained outside the palace while his companions entered. Something in his warrior's instincts had warned him to maintain his vigilance, and when he heard the terrible sounds of transformation echoing from within, he fled back through the forest to bring word to Odysseus of what had befallen their comrades. The news struck Odysseus like a physical blow. Once again, his men had fallen victim to powers beyond mortal comprehension, and once again, he faced the choice between prudent retreat and desperate rescue. But the bonds of loyalty that tied him to his followers were stronger than the counsels of safety. Taking up his sword and donning his armor, he prepared to enter the enchanted forest alone, determined to free his companions or die in the attempt. As he made his way through the shadowed paths towards Circe's palace, Odysseus encountered a figure that would prove crucial to his success. A young man of extraordinary beauty appeared before him, seemingly from nowhere, bearing the golden staff that marked him as a divine messenger. This was Hermes, son of Zeus, guide of souls and patron of travelers who had taken interest in the hero's plight. The god spoke with the casual authority of one accustomed to moving between the mortal and divine realms. He warned Odysseus of Circe's power and the fate that awaited him if he approached her palace unprepared. But he also offered aid, producing from the earth a small plant with a black root and milk-white flower. This was moly, a magical herb known only to the gods, which would protect him from Circe's transformative magic. Hermes instructed Odysseus in the precise manner he must employ to overcome the sorceress. He must accept her hospitality, but remain unaffected by her potion, then draw his sword and threaten her life. Only when she had sworn by the most binding oaths to work no harm against him should he accept her further offers of companionship. The god's advice carried the weight of divine wisdom, and Odysseus accepted both the magical herb and the counsel with grateful reverence. Armed with this protection, Odysseus approached Circe's palace with new confidence. The same wolves and lions that had observed Eurylochus's party regarded him with their unsettling intelligence, but they made no move to bar his path. The sorceress herself appeared at his call, as beautiful and welcoming as she had been to his companions, inviting him into her magnificent hall with every appearance of gracious hospitality. The scene that followed replayed the earlier drama with one crucial difference. Circe offered her guest the same drugged wine that had destroyed his companions, watching with barely concealed anticipation for the transformation to begin. But when Odysseus drank deeply of the potion and remained unchanged, her divine composure cracked for the first time in centuries. As you settle deeper into rest, let the rhythm of this ancient tale carry you toward peaceful dreams. Picture the sorceress's amazement as she raised her golden wand to complete the transformation, only to have Odysseus spring forward with his bronze sword drawn, its point at her throat. No mortal had ever resisted her magic before, and the shock of this unprecedented failure left her momentarily defenseless. Recognizing the divine protection that must shield her intended victim, Circe immediately understood that she faced no ordinary mortal. Her manner changed completely, from predatory confidence to genuine respect and, indeed, something approaching awe. She had encountered many heroes in her long existence, but none who could stand against her power while maintaining such dignity and purpose. When she asked his name, Odysseus revealed his true identity, and Circe's wonder increased. The fame of the sacker of Troy had reached even her isolated island, and she had heard prophecies that spoke of his eventual arrival at her palace. Swearing by the most sacred oaths that she would work no further harm against him or his companions, she welcomed him as an honored guest rather than potential prey. True to her word, Circe used her magic to restore his transformed companions to human form. The process was as swift as their original degradation had been. The sorceress passed among the penned swine, touching each with her wand and speaking words of power that stripped away their bestial nature. One by one, the men resumed their human shapes, but they appeared younger and more handsome than before, as if the magic had burned away not only their animal forms, but also the accumulated weariness of their long trials. The reunion between Odysseus and his rescued followers was deeply moving, marked by tears of joy and gratitude that reminded them all of their shared humanity. Even Eurylochus, who had counseled against any rescue attempt, wept to see his companions restored. The bonds forged in war and strengthened through suffering had proven stronger than the transformative power of divine magic. Circe's hospitality, once her enmity had been overcome, proved as generous as it had previously been treacherous. She provided the travelers with food and wine untainted by magic, soft beds for their rest, and companionship that restored their spirits after the horrors they had endured. The goddess herself seemed to take particular pleasure in Odysseus's company, engaging him in long conversations about the war at Troy, the nature of heroism, and the complex relationships between mortals and gods. Days passed in this pleasant respite, then weeks, then months. The island of Aiaia existed somewhat apart from the normal flow of time, and it was easy for weary travelers to lose themselves in its magical peace. Circe proved a fascinating companion, ancient beyond human comprehension, yet eternally youthful, possessed of knowledge that spanned the ages and wisdom earned through eons of experience. For Odysseus, the temptation to remain was particularly strong. Here was a life free from the struggles and sorrows that marked mortal existence, companion to a goddess who understood both his achievements and his ambitions. Circe made it clear that he would be welcome to stay forever, sharing in her immortal existence and the magical wonders of her realm. But as the seasons turned and a full year passed on the island, the pull of home began to reassert itself. His men, comfortable though they were, started to speak more frequently of Ithaca and the families they had left behind. The very peace that made Aiaia so appealing also served to highlight what they had lost, the connections to mortal life that gave their existence meaning and purpose. It was with considerable reluctance that Odysseus finally approached Circe to request her aid in continuing their journey. The goddess, though saddened by his decision, did not attempt to dissuade him. Perhaps her long existence had taught her the futility of trying to hold mortals against their deepest nature. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable than continued sanctuary: knowledge of the path that lay ahead. The way home, Circe revealed, led through dangers that would test not only his courage and cunning, but his very soul. Before he could return to Ithaca, he must undertake a journey that no living mortal had ever attempted. A voyage to the edge of the world itself, to the shadowy realm where the spirits of the dead dwelt in eternal twilight. As the night deepens around you and sleep draws near, let your mind drift to that moment when Odysseus learned the true scope of the trials that awaited him. The sorceress spoke of places beyond the normal world, the edge of ocean that encircled the earth, the grove sacred to Persephone, the entrance to Hades' dark kingdom. Only by consulting the shade of the prophet Tiresias could he learn the specific steps needed to appease Poseidon's wrath and find his way home. Circe provided detailed instructions for this unprecedented journey. She told him where to find the entrance to the underworld, what sacrifices to make, and how to summon the spirits of the dead without being overwhelmed by their desperate hunger for life. Most importantly, she warned him of the specific ghosts he must seek and avoid, for the realm of the dead held both wisdom and madness in equal measure. The preparations for departure were elaborate and solemn. Circe's magic had sustained them for a year, but now they would need mortal provisions for their journey into realms where divine protection might not extend. The goddess provided them with favorable winds, sturdy supplies, and her own blessing, but she could not shield them from the trials that lay ahead. On the morning of their departure, she stood upon the shore of Aya as they prepared their ship. Her divine beauty touched for the first time with something approaching mortal sadness. The year of companionship had affected her as well, reminding her of the connections she had forsaken in choosing her isolated existence. Yet she made no final plea for them to remain, understanding that their true destiny lay elsewhere. The journey to the edge of the world took them beyond the familiar waters of the Mediterranean into realms where geography gave way to mythology. The sea itself began to change, taking on qualities that suggested they were leaving the normal world behind. The water became darker, almost black, and strange currents pulled at their ship, with forces that seemed to originate from beyond the physical realm. They sailed past islands that appeared and disappeared like dreams, through fogs that carried whispers in unknown languages, across waters where the normal rules of navigation no longer applied. The sun itself seemed different here, providing less warmth and casting shadows that fell in impossible directions. This was the edge of ocean, the vast river that the ancients believed encircled the entire world, separating the realm of the living from the domains of gods and the dead. At last, they reached the shore Circe had described, a desolate coast where the rivers Acheron and Cocytus flowed together into the dark waters of the Styx. The land beyond the beach was shrouded in perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something between the two. No birds sang in this place, no insects buzzed, no wind stirred the strange vegetation that grew in the eternal gloom. Following Circe's precise instructions, Odysseus chose a spot where the two rivers converged and began to dig a pit with his bronze sword. The earth here was different from any he had known, dark and rich, but cold to the touch, as if it had never known the warmth of sunlight. When the pit was deep enough, he performed the ritual sacrifices the sorceress had prescribed, pouring libations of milk and honey, wine and water, while his men maintained their vigil around the sacred site. The moment the sacrificial blood touched the earth, the very air began to change. Shadows that had seemed empty started to take on substance and form, and gradually, the spirits of the dead began to emerge from the depths of Hades' kingdom. They came slowly at first, then in ever-increasing numbers, wraiths and phantoms drawn by the scent of warm blood and the possibility of briefly reclaiming something of their lost life. As you drift toward your own peaceful rest, Imagine the awe and terror that must have filled those mortal hearts as they witnessed this unprecedented gathering. The shades that emerged from the underworld retained the forms they had worn in life, but they were translucent and insubstantial, more like memories made visible than actual beings. Yet in their ghostly eyes burned an intelligence and longing that spoke of consciousness continuing beyond the grave. The first spirit to approach was that of Elpenor, one of Odysseus's own men who had died on Circe's island. In their haste to depart, they had left his body unburied, a tragedy that bound his soul to wander in limbo, unable to find rest among the other dead. The ghost's first words were not of greeting, but of desperate pleading for the funeral rites that would allow him to join his fellows in Hades' realm. Odysseus was moved by his followers' plight and promised to return to Aea to give Elpenor the proper burial he deserved. But even as he spoke with this familiar shade, other spirits pressed closer, drawn by the magical blood that could temporarily restore their memories and voices. He had to drive them back with his drawn sword, for Circe had warned him that he must speak first with Tiresias, the blind prophet whose wisdom transcended even death. When Tiresias finally appeared among the gathering shades, his presence commanded immediate respect from both the living and the dead. In life, he had been the greatest seer in all of Greece, a man granted the gift of prophecy by the gods themselves. His blindness, paradoxically, had allowed him to see truths hidden from those who relied on mortal sight. Even death had not diminished his prophetic powers, and his spirit retained the authority that had made kings seek his counsel. The prophet's words, when he finally spoke after drinking of the sacrificial blood, carried the weight of divine revelation. He confirmed what Odysseus had already suspected, that Poseidon's wrath was the primary force keeping him from his homeland. The sea god's anger over the blinding of Polyphemus had transformed what should have been a brief voyage into an ordeal of mythic proportions. But Tiresias also revealed that the path home, while difficult, was not impossible. There was a way to appease Poseidon's anger, though it would require patience, sacrifice, and adherence to specific conditions. The prophet spoke of dangers yet to come, the Sirens whose song could drive men mad, the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis, the cattle of the sun god that must not be harmed under any circumstances. Most importantly, Tiresias revealed the ultimate key to Odysseus's return. After reaching Ithaca, and the prophet assured him that he would eventually reach his homeland, he would need to undertake one final journey. He must carry an oar inland until he reached a place where people had never seen the sea, where they would mistake his oar for a winnowing fan. There, he must make sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then would the sea god's anger be fully appeased. The prophecy extended even beyond Odysseus's homecoming, revealing glimpses of his future years. He would live to old age, dying peacefully when death came to him from the sea, a fate that seemed contradictory, but would eventually prove prophetic in ways the hero could not yet understand. The knowledge was both comforting and unsettling, offering hope for survival while hinting at complexities yet to be resolved. After Tiresias departed, other spirits approached the pit, each eager for their moment of restored consciousness. Odysseus spoke with his own mother, Anticlea, learning to his grief that she had died of sorrow while he was away, never knowing whether her son had survived the war at Troy. The conversation was heartbreaking. She tried to embrace him, but her ghostly form passed through his solid flesh like mist, leaving both of them aching with the impossibility of their reunion. Among the other shades were many he had known in life, warriors who had fallen at Troy, kings who had ruled in ages past, women whose beauty or wisdom had made them legendary. Each had a story to tell, and each reminded him of the rich tapestry of human experience that connected all mortals across the generations. The underworld, he realized, was not just a place of punishment, but a repository of all human memory and achievement. Yet the most disturbing encounter came with the shade of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek host at Troy. In life, Achilles had been offered a choice between a long, obscure existence and a short life crowned with eternal glory. He had chosen fame over longevity, and his deeds in battle had indeed made him immortal in song and story. But his ghostly words revealed the bitter truth behind heroic legend. "I would rather be a serf on earth serving another man," Achilles declared, "than rule over all the dead in Hades." The hero who had seemed to embody the very ideal of glorious warfare now spoke of the emptiness of posthumous fame compared to the simple joy of being alive. His words served as a sobering reminder of the value of the life that Odysseus was fighting to preserve and the home he was struggling to reach. As the night continues to embrace you and your thoughts grow quiet, let the rhythm of this ancient tale carry you toward peaceful dreams. The time came for Odysseus to leave the realm of the dead, but the journey had fundamentally changed him. He had looked upon the ultimate fate that awaited all mortals and had seen both the grandeur and the futility of human ambition. The knowledge would inform all his future choices, tempering his pride with humility and his ambition with wisdom. The return journey from the edge of the world was swifter than their outward voyage, as if the normal currents of existence were drawing them back toward the realm of the living. They stopped at Aiaia as promised, where Circe greeted them with neither surprise nor reproach. She had known that their year of respite was only an interlude in a larger story, and she was prepared to help them take the next steps toward their ultimate destination. While his men prepared Elpenor's funeral pyre and performed the rites that would finally allow their comrade's spirit to find rest, Odysseus consulted privately with Circe about the revelations he had received in Hades. The sorceress listened to Tiresias's prophecy with the attention it deserved, then provided additional counsel about the specific dangers that lay ahead. She spoke first of the Sirens, those enchanting creatures whose song had the power to drive men mad with desire. Every sailor who had ever heard their voices had steered his ship toward their island, only to perish on the sharp rocks that surrounded their dwelling. The bones of their victims lay scattered across the beach, a testament to the deadly power of their music. Yet the Sirens' song was not merely destructive. It was said to contain knowledge of everything that had ever happened or ever would happen, making it irresistibly attractive to those who sought wisdom. Circe's advice for dealing with this threat was characteristically practical. Odysseus must stop the ears of his men with soft wax so they could not hear the deadly song. But if he wished to hear it himself, and she seemed to understand that his curiosity would make this inevitable, he must have his men bind him to the ship's mast with ropes so tight that he could not break free. Under no circumstances should they release him, no matter how he might plead or command. Beyond the Sirens lay an even more formidable challenge, the strait where the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis guarded the only passage through the western seas. Scylla was a creature of nightmare, once a beautiful nymph but transformed by jealous magic into a six-headed monster that dwelt in a cliffside cave. Each of her heads possessed a mouth filled with 3 rows of sharp teeth, and she would snatch sailors from any ship that passed too close to her lair. Charybdis was equally terrible in her own way, a massive whirlpool that sucked down entire ships 3 times each day, then spewed forth their wreckage in a maelstrom of destruction. The strait between Scylla and Charybdis was narrow, forcing any ship to pass within reach of one or the other. Circe counseled that it was better to lose a few men to Scylla than to risk the entire ship to Charybdis, advice that was tactically sound but emotionally devastating to contemplate. The final danger she described was perhaps the most insidious because it would not appear dangerous at all. On the island of Thrinacia grazed the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. These magnificent beasts were immortal, neither breeding nor dying, but simply existing in eternal perfection as symbols of their divine owner's power. Under no circumstances must they be harmed, for Helios would demand terrible vengeance for any injury to his sacred herd. This warning would prove prophetic in ways that neither Circe nor Odysseus could fully anticipate. The cattle represented not just a physical temptation, but a test of leadership, discipline, and the ability to maintain hope in the face of despair. The choice between starvation and sacrilege would tear at the very foundations of the bonds that held the crew together. Armed with this knowledge and the goddess's blessing, Odysseus and his men set sail from Aea for the final time. The enchanted island faded into the distance behind them, taking with it the last refuge they would find in their long journey home. From this point forward, they would face their trials with only mortal resources, depending on their own courage, wisdom, and unity to see them through. The first test came sooner than expected. As they approached the island of the Sirens, the wind died away completely, leaving their ship becalmed in waters that seemed almost supernaturally still. The silence was profound. No sound of waves against the hull, no cry of seabirds, no whisper of breeze through the rigging. It was as if the very sea was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus took soft beeswax and warmed it in his hands until it became pliable, then carefully sealed the ears of each of his men. He could see the trust in their eyes as they submitted to this strange ritual, trusting their king's judgment even when they could not understand the full scope of the danger they faced. Once their hearing was blocked, he gestured for them to bind him securely to the mast, wrapping the rope so tightly that he could barely breathe. The Sirens' Island appeared through the morning mist like a vision from a dream. It was beautiful beyond description. White cliffs rising from crystal clear waters, beaches of golden sand where strange flowers bloomed in profusion. But the beauty was marred by the grisly evidence of the creature's true nature. The beaches were littered with bones, not just human remains, but the broken planks and metal fittings of countless ships that had been lured to destruction. As you allow yourself to drift deeper into rest, imagine the moment when the Sirens' song first reached Odysseus's ears. It began as a whisper so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind, then gradually grew in volume and complexity until it filled the air with the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The voices were beyond mortal ability, pure and clear as mountain streams, yet rich with harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very bones. But it was not just the beauty of the music that made it so compelling. The Sirens sang of knowledge, of secrets hidden since the dawn of time, of the future that lay shrouded in mystery, of the very thoughts and dreams that lived in Odysseus's own heart. They knew of his achievements at Troy, his longing for home, his deepest fears and highest aspirations. Their songs seemed to offer not just pleasure, but understanding, a communion of souls that transcended the barriers between mortal and divine. The temptation was overwhelming. Every fiber of Odysseus's being strained toward that enchanted shore, toward the promise of wisdom and beauty that the Sirens offered. He fought against his bonds with desperate strength, crying out to his men to untie him, to let him answer the call that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. But his followers, their ears sealed against the deadly music, could only see his struggles without understanding their cause. They had been instructed to ignore his commands, and they held true to their orders, despite his increasingly frantic pleas. The ship passed slowly through the strait, its crew rowing with steady determination, while their king writhed against his bonds like a man possessed. The Sirens' song grew ever more desperate as their prey began to slip away, their voices taking on notes of pleading and promise that would have melted the heart of any unbound listener. They offered Odysseus glory beyond imagination, knowledge beyond measure, pleasures beyond description, anything that might lure him into their fatal embrace. But the ropes held, and the wax held, and gradually the island fell behind them. The Sirens' voices faded to whispers, then to silence, leaving only the normal sounds of sea and wind. When his men finally untied their king and removed the wax from their ears, they found Odysseus weeping, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming beauty of what he had heard and the terrible knowledge of what it had cost him to resist. Yet even as he mourned the loss of that transcendent music, Odysseus understood that he had gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that he could resist even the most perfect temptation when duty and love demanded it. The Sirens had tested not just his physical restraint, but his spiritual commitment to the path he had chosen. By refusing their offer, he had proven to himself that his desire to return home was stronger than any other longing. The victory over the Sirens' temptation proved short-lived, for ahead lay the strait that Circe had described in such frightening detail. The water itself seemed to change as they approached, taking on a quality that suggested they were entering a realm where the normal rules of nature might not apply. Strange currents pulled at their ship, and the very air seemed thick with malevolent presence. The strait was narrower than Odysseus had imagined, barely wide enough for a ship to pass through even under the most favorable conditions. On one side rose a cliff so sheer it seemed to pierce the very sky, its face marked by a cave opening that yawned like a mouth filled with darkness. This was Scylla's lair, and even from a distance they could see the terrible creature moving within the shadows. 6 long necks, writhing like serpents, each topped with a head that bore a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. On the opposite side of the strait, the sea itself seemed to be alive with malevolent energy. This was Charybdis, the whirlpool that sucked down ships and sailors alike. 3 times each day, the monster would draw in vast quantities of seawater, creating a vortex that could drag even the largest vessel to destruction. The timing of their approach was critical. They would need to pass through during the brief periods when the whirlpool was quiescent. As the night deepens around you and sleep begins to claim your thoughts, picture those brave sailors as they approached this terrible choice. Odysseus had to decide whether to risk his entire crew to Charybdis or accept the certain loss of 6 men to Scylla's ravening heads. The decision tore at his heart, for these men had followed him faithfully through countless dangers, and now he was forced to choose which of them would die. In the end, he chose the course that Circe had recommended, to steer closer to Scylla's cliff and accept the loss of some of his men rather than risk the destruction of his entire ship. It was a commander's decision, based on cold calculation rather than emotion, but it would haunt him for the rest of his days. He did not tell his crew of the choice he had made, knowing that the knowledge would only make their passage more terrifying. As they entered the strait, Odysseus took his position at the stern, armed with 2 spears and ready to fight whatever might threaten his ship. His men rowed with desperate determination, their eyes fixed on the water ahead as they tried to maintain their course between the twin perils. The sound of Charybdis filled the air, a roaring, sucking noise that spoke of destruction lurking just below the surface. The attack came with shocking swiftness. Scylla's 6 heads struck like lightning, each one seizing a sailor and lifting him screaming from the deck. The men called out to Odysseus by name as they were dragged toward the monster's cave, their voices echoing off the cliff walls in a chorus of despair. It was the most heartbreaking sight the king of Ithaca had ever witnessed, his faithful followers dying while calling for help he could not provide. The surviving crew rowed with frantic energy, driven by terror and grief in equal measure. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of Scylla devouring her victims, but they dared not look back. The straits seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each stroke of the oars bringing them closer to safety. but also deeper into the realm of nightmare they had entered. At last, they burst free of the strait into open water, leaving the monsters behind, but carrying with them the memory of their lost companions. 6 more empty places on the benches, 6 more families in Ithaca who would never see their loved ones return. The crew that had once numbered in the hundreds was now reduced to barely more than a dozen men, each one a survivor of trials that would have destroyed lesser mortals. The immediate aftermath of their escape was marked by a grief so profound that speech seemed inadequate. The men who had been taken by Scylla were not just comrades, but friends, brothers in all but blood, whose loss created wounds that would never fully heal. Yet even in their sorrow, they had to continue, for the sea around them offered no place of refuge where they might properly mourn their dead. Their next landfall came at the island of Thrinacia, where the sacred cattle of Helios grazed in their eternal pastures. The island appeared peaceful and welcoming after the horrors they had just endured, its green hills and gentle shores offering the promise of rest and recovery. But Odysseus remembered Circe's warning and tried to convince his men to pass by without landing, to seek their respite elsewhere. The crew, however, had reached the limits of their endurance. They had faced monster after monster, watched their comrades die in the most terrible ways imaginable, and suffered hardships that would have broken ordinary men. The sight of that peaceful island was more than they could resist, and they pleaded with their king to allow them to rest, to tend their wounds, and to honor their fallen friends with proper funeral rites. Reluctantly, Odysseus agreed to land, but only after extracting solemn oaths from every man that they would not harm the sacred cattle under any circumstances. The animals were clearly marked by their divine nature, larger and more beautiful than any mortal beasts, with hides that gleamed like precious metals and eyes that held an almost human intelligence. They moved through their pastures with a majesty that proclaimed their sacred status to any who observed them. For a time, the oath held firm. The men subsisted on their remaining provisions and such fish as they could catch from the island's shores. They performed funeral rites for their lost comrades, built a small shrine to honor their memory, and tried to restore their spirits for the final push toward home. Odysseus himself spent long hours in prayer and meditation, seeking divine guidance for the trials that surely lay ahead. But as days turned to weeks, their situation grew increasingly desperate. The provisions they had brought from Circe's island were exhausted, and the fishing proved inadequate to sustain them. Worse, the winds that had carried them to Thrinacia had died away completely, leaving them stranded with no means of departure. The very air seemed to hold them prisoner, as if the gods themselves were testing their resolve. As you rest in peaceful slumber, let your mind drift to those hungry sailors as they watch the sacred cattle grazing in their eternal contentment. The animals seemed to mock their suffering, fat and sleek, while the men grew gaunt with hunger, divine and untouchable, while mortal flesh wasted away. The temptation grew stronger with each passing day, whispered conversations turning to desperate plans as starvation began to claim their reason. The crisis came when Odysseus, driven by desperation, climbed to the island's highest peak to pray for divine intervention. While he was gone, his lieutenant Eurylochus addressed the surviving crew with words that seemed reasonable, but carried the seeds of destruction. He spoke of their noble struggle, their faithful service, their right to preserve their own lives even at the cost of divine displeasure. Death by starvation, he argued, was no more honorable than death by divine wrath, and at least they could die with full bellies. The logic was seductive to men pushed beyond their limits. When Odysseus returned from his prayers, he found his men preparing to slaughter the finest of Helios's cattle. their sacred oath forgotten in the face of immediate necessity. His pleas and commands fell on deaf ears. The crew had made their choice, and not even their beloved king could turn them from their course. The slaughter itself was marked by omens that should have terrified any rational man. The cattle's blood ran black instead of red, the meat lowed as it roasted on the spits, and the hides crawled with unnatural life, even after being flayed from the carcasses. But hunger had driven the men beyond fear, and they consumed the sacred flesh with desperate gratitude, knowing even as they ate that they were sealing their doom. Helios's rage, when it came, shook the very foundations of heaven and earth. The sun god appeared before Zeus himself, demanding vengeance for the sacrilege committed against his sacred herd. If justice was not done, he threatened to take his light to the underworld, leaving the earth in eternal darkness. Zeus, recognizing the threat to cosmic order itself, promised swift retribution. The divine punishment came as soon as Odysseus and his men put to sea. They had barely cleared the island's harbor when Zeus gathered his storm clouds and hurled his most terrible thunderbolt at their ship. The vessel exploded in a shower of splinters and flame, the divine fire consuming everything it touched. The men who had eaten the sacred beef were struck dead instantly, their bodies disappearing beneath the wine-dark waves without a trace. Only Odysseus survived the divine wrath, and only because he had refused to participate in the sacrilege. He found himself clinging to the broken mast of his ship as the waves carried him away from the scene of destruction. In a single moment, his long journey had been transformed from a tale of homecoming into one of solitary survival. The last of his loyal followers were gone, victims of their own desperation and the inexorable justice of the gods. Alone on the vast sea, Odysseus faced the greatest trial of his Odyssey, not the physical dangers of monsters and storms, but the spiritual challenge of maintaining hope when all seemed lost. The makeshift raft he constructed from the ship's remains was barely seaworthy, offering no protection from the elements and no means of navigation beyond the stars. Yet he clung to life with the same determination that had carried him through every previous trial. The currents carried him westward for 9 days and nights, during which time he endured thirst, hunger, and exposure that would have killed a lesser man. The sun burned his skin by day while the cold of night chilled him to the bone. Dolphins and seabirds were his only companions, and he began to understand something of the profound loneliness that had driven the Sirens to lure sailors to their doom. On the 10th day, his raft was caught in a powerful current that drew him inexorably toward a familiar strait. To his horror, he realized he was being carried back towards Scylla and Charybdis, the twin perils he had barely escaped before. But this time, he faced them alone, without a ship or crew, armed with nothing but his will to survive. As the night continues to embrace you in its gentle peace, picture that solitary figure as he approached the terrible whirlpool for the second time. Charybdis was in her active phase, sucking down vast quantities of seawater in her 3 daily feeding. The current was irresistible, and Odysseus found his fragile craft being drawn into the vortex, despite his desperate efforts to escape. At the last moment, as his raft was about to be dragged beneath the surface, Odysseus leaped upward and caught hold of a massive fig tree that grew from the cliff face above the whirlpool. The ancient tree's roots had found purchase in the rocky crevices, and its branches hung low enough over the water to offer salvation to a desperate man. He clung to the rough bark with hands that bled from the effort, his legs dangling over the churning waters as Charybdis devoured his makeshift vessel. For hours he hung suspended between sea and sky, his arms aching with the strain while the monster below completed her terrible cycle. The fig tree swayed in the wind, threatening to shake loose his precarious grip, while the spray from the whirlpool soaked him with each massive surge. Death seemed certain, either from exhaustion that would loosen his hold, or from the monster's next feeding when the waters would rise high enough to claim him. But as evening approached, Charybdis began to regurgitate the water she had consumed, and among the debris that came surging upward were the remains of his raft. The broken mast and a few splintered planks rode the violent current like driftwood, and Odysseus waited for the precise moment when they would pass directly beneath his perch. With a prayer to all the gods who might still show him mercy, he released his grip and dropped into the churning foam. The impact nearly stunned him, but desperation gave him strength beyond his normal limits. He managed to grasp the floating timber and pull himself partially clear of the water, creating a crude but serviceable vessel from the wreckage of his previous craft. The current that had nearly destroyed him now carried him away from the whirlpool, bearing him westward toward whatever fate awaited him in the unknown reaches of the sea. For 7 more days he drifted, sustained by nothing more than determination and the occasional sip of rainwater that collected in the hollows of his makeshift raft. The sun blazed down mercilessly during the day, while at night the cold penetrated to his very bones. His lips cracked and bled, his skin burned and peeled, and his body began to consume itself in its desperate need for sustenance. Yet still he clung to life, driven by a vision of home that burned brighter than any physical discomfort. On the 7th day, as consciousness began to fade and death seemed inevitable, the outline of an island appeared through the heat haze on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be another hallucination, for his mind had begun to play tricks on him in his extremity. But as the hours passed, the land grew larger and more distinct, until he could make out beaches and forests that spoke of a place where mortal life might be sustained. The island was Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas who held up the heavens themselves. It was a place of surpassing beauty, where eternal spring reigned and every variety of tree and flower bloomed in perpetual perfection. Crystal springs fed streams that meandered through meadows carpeted with violets and asphodels, while fruit trees heavy with golden offerings lined the shores of sheltered coves. Calypso herself was a being of divine beauty and ancient wisdom, possessing powers that rivaled those of the great goddesses of Olympus. She had chosen to live apart from both gods and mortals, creating for herself a paradise where time moved slowly and sorrow was unknown. Her palace was a marvel of natural architecture, a great cave carved from living rock and furnished with treasures that sparkled like captured starlight. When the nymph discovered Odysseus's broken body washed up on her beach, she was moved by a combination of pity and fascination. Here was the famous hero whose exploits had made him legendary even among the immortals, reduced to a barely breathing wreck by the trials he had endured. Using her divine powers, she nursed him back to health, tending his wounds with magical salves and feeding him on ambrosia and nectar until his strength began to return. As you allow sleep to deepen around you like the peaceful waters of Calypso's hidden cove, imagine the hero's slow recovery in that place of eternal beauty. For weeks, he lay in a delirium of exhaustion and grief, haunted by memories of his lost companions and the destruction of his last ship. The nymph attended him with divine patience, understanding that his wounds went far deeper than mere physical injury. Gradually, as his body healed and his mind cleared, Odysseus began to appreciate the extraordinary nature of his refuge. Calypso's island existed somewhat outside the normal flow of time, protected by her divine power from the storms and sorrows that plagued the mortal world. Here was peace such as he had never known. No enemies to fight, no decisions to make, no responsibilities beyond the simple pleasure of existence. The nymph herself proved a fascinating companion, possessed of knowledge that spanned the ages and wisdom earned through eons of contemplation. She had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, seen heroes and kings reduced to dust, while she remained eternally youthful. Her stories of the ancient world enchanted Odysseus during the long evenings when they sat together beneath stars that seemed brighter than any he had seen in mortal lands. But it was not just companionship that Calypso offered. As the months passed and became years, she made her deeper intentions clear. She loved the mortal hero with a passion that burned like divine fire, and she offered him something no mortal had ever been granted: immortality itself. If he would consent to remain with her as her consort, she would make him a god, freeing him forever from the limitations and sorrows of human existence. The temptation was unlike any he had faced in his long wandering. Here was not just comfort and safety, but transcendence itself, the chance to step beyond mortality and join the ranks of the immortals. Calypso's love was genuine and profound, offering not just physical pleasure, but spiritual communion with a being whose wisdom exceeded that of any mortal teacher. The years of struggle and loss, the memories of war and wandering, all could be left behind like a discarded cloak. Yet, as the seasons turned and 7 years passed on the enchanted island, Odysseus found himself growing increasingly restless. The very perfection of his life with Calypso began to feel like a beautiful prison, cutting him off from the messy, uncertain, but meaningful existence he had known as a mortal king. The immortality she offered would make him something other than human, and he began to understand that his humanity itself was what gave his life its deepest meaning. More than anything else, it was the memory of Penelope that kept him anchored to his mortal identity. His wife had waited for him through the long years of war, and she was waiting still, if she lived, for his return. The love between them was not the transcendent passion that Calypso offered, but something earthier and more enduring, a partnership forged in shared struggle, mutual respect, and the deep bonds of mortal marriage. As time passed, Odysseus began to spend his days sitting on the cliffs that overlooked the western sea, gazing toward the horizon where Ithaca lay beyond his sight. Calypso watched his growing melancholy with divine understanding, recognizing the signs of a spirit that could not be content with even the most perfect captivity. Yet her love made it difficult for her to release him, and she continued to hope that time would eventually reconcile him to his divine fate. The resolution came not from any earthly source, but from the intervention of the gods themselves. On Olympus, Athena had not forgotten her favored hero, and she chose a moment when Poseidon was absent from the divine council to plead Odysseus's case before her father Zeus. The king of the gods, moved by his daughter's eloquence and perhaps weary of the sea god's lengthy revenge, decreed that the time had come for the wanderer to complete his journey home. Zeus dispatched Hermes, the messenger god, to deliver his command to Calypso. The divine herald appeared on Ogygia with all the majesty of Olympus behind him, bearing the irrevocable word of the thunder-bearer himself. Calypso must release her mortal lover and provide him with the means to continue his journey, for such was the will of the supreme god. The nymph's grief at receiving this command was profound and moving. She had loved Odysseus with a pure and generous heart, offering him gifts that no mortal had ever received. Yet she was bound by divine law to obey Zeus's decree, however much it might cost her personally. With dignity befitting her immortal nature, she accepted the inevitable and prepared to grant her beloved his freedom. When she brought Odysseus the news of his impending departure, his reaction was complex and deeply human. Joy at the prospect of freedom was mixed with genuine sorrow at leaving Calypso, for he had come to love her in his own way, though not with the complete devotion she desired. The years on Ogygia had been a respite from suffering, and he would always be grateful for the compassion she had shown him in his darkest hour. As the night settles deeper around you and your breathing grows slow and peaceful, picture the preparations for departure that followed. Calypso, with divine grace, provided Odysseus with everything he would need for his final voyage. Using her powers, she caused great trees to appear on the beach, pines and poplars, and alders with trunks perfectly suited for shipbuilding. She provided him with divine tools that made the work swift and sure, and her own hands helped shape the vessel that would carry him away from her forever. The ship they built together was a marvel of craftsmanship, larger and more seaworthy than anything Odysseus could have constructed with mortal tools alone. Calypso wove sails from divine fabric that would never tear or fade, and she stocked the vessel with provisions that would sustain him for however long his journey might take. Most precious of all, she gave him her blessing and her promise that no harm would come to him from any power she controlled. On the morning of his departure, Calypso stood on the beach where they had first met, her divine beauty unmarred by the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks. She made no final plea for him to stay, asked for no promise of return, but simply watched as the man she loved more than her own immortality sailed away toward a destiny she could not share. The sea that bore Odysseus away from Ogygia was calm and welcoming, as different from the storm-tossed waters of his earlier voyages as paradise from purgatory. For 17 days he sailed with favorable winds, following the stars as Calypso had taught him, drawing ever closer to the mortal world he had left behind. Each league of progress filled him with renewed hope, for he could sense that his long exile was finally nearing its end. But Poseidon, returning from his sojourn among the distant Ethiopians, discovered that his revenge was being thwarted by the will of Zeus himself. The sea god's wrath at this development was terrible to behold, and though he could not directly defy his brother's decree, he could still make the final portion of Odysseus's journey as difficult as possible. The storm that Poseidon sent was unlike anything the hero had yet endured, a tempest that seemed to contain all the gods' accumulated fury over the blinding of his sun. Waves tall as mountains crashed over the small ship. Winds howled with voices that spoke of divine vengeance, and lightning split the sky in displays that illuminated the full scope of Odysseus's peril. For 2 days and nights, the storm raged, reducing the beautiful vessel Calypso had helped him build to little more than driftwood. His divine provisions were washed overboard, his sails torn to ribbons, his mast snapped like a twig in the supernatural gale. Once again, Odysseus found himself clinging to wreckage, while the wine-dark sea tried to claim him for its own. It was then that he received unexpected aid from a source he had never anticipated. Ino, a sea nymph who had once been mortal herself, took pity on his plight and appeared to him in the form of a seabird. She offered him her divine veil, a magical garment that would keep him afloat no matter how fierce the storm might become. With this protection, he could abandon his failing ship and trust to swimming, a desperate chance, but better than certain death among the wreckage. For 2 more days, Odysseus battled the waves with nothing but the sea nymph's veil to sustain him, his arms and legs moving in mechanical rhythm while his mind focused on the single goal of survival. The storm gradually began to abate as Poseidon's immediate wrath was spent, but the hero was left alone in an empty sea with no idea of his location or the direction of the nearest land. Salvation came at last in the form of a coastline that appeared through the morning mist. Not the familiar shores of Ithaca, but the island kingdom of the Phaeacians, a people blessed by the gods with peace, prosperity, and the finest ships in all the world. Their island of Scheria was a place where the old heroic values still flourished, where hospitality was sacred, and the bonds between guest and host were considered inviolable. The beach where Odysseus finally dragged himself ashore was a perfect crescent of golden sand backed by olive groves and flowering meadows. His body was battered beyond recognition, his skin burned by salt and sun, his strength reduced to the bare minimum needed to crawl above the tide line, but he was alive, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt himself to be within reach of his homeland. As you rest in the depths of peaceful sleep, let your mind drift to that exhausted hero as he lay hidden among the olive trees, covered with fallen leaves like a dying ember, carefully preserved beneath cold ashes. His trials were not yet over, but the worst of his wandering was behind him. The Phaeacians would prove to be the final link in the chain that would carry him home, though the homecoming itself would bring challenges as great as any he had faced in his long Odyssey. The discovery of the shipwrecked stranger came about through the agency of Athena, who had been watching over her favorite mortal with divine concern. The goddess appeared to Nausicaa, the young daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, in a dream that inspired her to organize a washing expedition to the very beach where Odysseus lay hidden. Princess Nausicaa was a maiden of extraordinary beauty and wisdom, raised in the sheltered perfection of her father's court, but possessed of the intelligence and courage that marked her as worthy of her royal blood. When she and her handmaidens arrived at the river mouth near the shore, they spent the morning washing clothes and spreading them to dry in the bright sunshine, their laughter echoing across the peaceful landscape. It was their game of ball, played while waiting for the laundry to dry, that finally awakened Odysseus from his exhausted sleep. One errant throw sent the ball rolling toward the olive grove, where he lay concealed, and when one of the girls ran to retrieve it, she caught sight of the wild figure that emerged from the undergrowth. Odysseus's appearance was shocking. Naked except for a hastily gathered branch, his body marked by countless scars and wounds, his hair and beard matted with salt and sand. The handmaidens fled in terror, but Nausicaa stood her ground with royal composure, recognizing that this apparition was a man in desperate need rather than some dangerous wild creature. The hero's address to the princess displayed all the diplomatic skill that had made him famous, combined with genuine gratitude for her courage in not fleeing. He spoke of her beauty in terms that compared her to the goddess Artemis, praised her noble bearing, and humbly requested aid in reaching her father's court. His words were chosen to reassure her of his peaceful intentions, while acknowledging his complete dependence on her goodwill. Nausicaa's response revealed both her natural generosity and her quick intelligence. She provided Odysseus with clothing from their washing, directed him to a sacred grove where he could bathe and restore something of his former appearance, and gave him careful instructions for approaching her father's palace. Most importantly, she warned him that he must throw himself on the protection of her mother, Queen Arete, whose word carried great weight in all matters of hospitality and judgment. The palace of the Phaeacians, when Odysseus finally approached it that evening, was a wonder that surpassed even the magical realms he had visited in his wandering. Built of bronze and gold, decorated with precious stones and metals, surrounded by gardens where fruit trees bore year-round and fountains played in eternal music, it represented the pinnacle of mortal achievement in harmony with divine blessing. King Alcinous received the mysterious stranger with the perfect courtesy required by the ancient laws of hospitality. No questions were asked about his identity or purpose until he had been fed, bathed, and provided with clean clothing. Only when his immediate needs had been met did the king inquire about his guest's origins and the circumstances that had brought him to Phaeacian shores. It was then that Odysseus, after 20 years of wandering and 10 years of exile, finally told his complete story to an audience worthy of hearing it. Through the long night, he spoke, relating every detail of his Odyssey from the fall of Troy to his arrival on their beach. The court listened in rapt attention as he described encounters with gods and monsters, the loss of his ships and men, the temptations that had tested his resolve, and the ultimate loyalty to home and family that had sustained him through every trial. The Phaeacians were moved to tears by this tale of suffering and endurance, recognizing in Odysseus the embodiment of the heroic ideals they cherished. King Alcinous immediately promised to provide his guest with safe passage home, offering the services of his finest ship and most skilled crew. More than that, he loaded the vessel with treasures that would more than compensate for all the wealth Odysseus had lost in his wandering. Gold and silver, fine clothing, and precious objects that marked the generosity of his hosts. As the gentle rhythms of sleep carry you deeper into rest, imagine that final voyage across the wine-dark sea. The Phaeacian ship was magical in its swiftness, covering the distance between Scheria and Ithaca in a single night's sailing. The crew needed no charts or stars to guide them. Their vessels were blessed by Poseidon himself in the days before his quarrel with Odysseus, and they could find any harbour in the world without error. Odysseus slept during the entire voyage, his first peaceful rest in years of struggle and uncertainty. The Phaeacian sailors, following their king's instructions, carried him gently ashore on a beach he had known since childhood, placing him beneath an olive tree with his treasure arranged around him. When they departed before dawn, they left no trace of their presence, save the sleeping hero and the evidence of their extraordinary generosity. The sun was well advanced when Odysseus finally awoke on the shore of his beloved Ithaca. At first, he did not recognize the place, for Athena had cast a mist over the familiar landscape to give her beloved hero time to plan his approach. 20 years had passed since he had last seen these shores, and he needed to understand how much had changed in his absence before revealing his identity to anyone. The goddess appeared to him in the guise of a young shepherd, and through their conversation, she gradually revealed the true state of affairs in his kingdom. His wife Penelope remained faithful, but was under constant pressure from more than 100 suitors who had invaded his palace, consumed his wealth, and demanded that she choose one of them as her new husband. His son Telemachus had grown to manhood, but was powerless to expel the invaders, while his aged father Laertes had withdrawn to a farm in the countryside, overcome with grief at his son's supposed death. The situation required not just courage, but careful planning, for Odysseus was outnumbered more than 100 to 1. Athena provided him with a magical disguise, transforming his appearance so completely that he appeared to be an aged beggar marked by poverty and hardship. In this guise, he could move freely through his own kingdom, gathering information and preparing for the moment when he would reclaim his throne. His first ally was the faithful swineherd Eumaeus, who had served the royal house since childhood and had never given up hope of his master's return. The man's loyalty was deeply moving. He welcomed the disguised beggar into his humble dwelling, shared his simple food without question, and spoke of his lost king with tears of genuine affection. Here was proof that not all of Ithaca had forgotten the values that Odysseus represented. Through Eumaeus, Odysseus learned the full extent of the crisis facing his household. The suitors, led by Antinous and Eurymachus, had essentially declared themselves the new rulers of Ithaca, treating his palace as their own and his property as their inheritance. They showed no respect for the gods, the law, or the rights of others, representing everything that the hero had fought against throughout his long career. The reunion with his son Telemachus was deeply emotional, though it required careful orchestration by Athena to ensure privacy and safety. When the goddess temporarily restored Odysseus to his true appearance, the young man at first could not believe that this was really his long-lost father. 20 years of separation had left them strangers, but the bonds of blood and the shared commitment to restoring their house's honor quickly united them in common purpose. Together, father and son planned the strategy that would rid their palace of the unwelcome invaders. It would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the kind of cunning that had made Odysseus famous throughout the Greek world. They would use the suitors' own arrogance and complacency against them, turning their very confidence into the instrument of their destruction. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep, let your mind follow the disguised king as he finally approached the palace that had been his home for so many years. The building was much as he remembered it, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where once there had been order and dignity, now there was chaos and waste. The suitors had turned his great hall into their private playground, feasting on his livestock, drinking his wine, and showing contempt for everything he had held sacred. The most painful moment came when Odysseus encountered his old hunting dog, Argos. lying on a dung heap outside the palace gates. The faithful animal had waited 20 years for his master's return, and though age and neglect had reduced him to a pitiful shadow of his former self, he alone among all the inhabitants of Ithaca recognized Odysseus immediately. The dog's tail wagged weakly in greeting, and then, as if his vigil was finally complete, he died peacefully in the knowledge that his beloved master had come home at last. Inside the palace, Odysseus endured the insults and abuse of the suitors, while gathering crucial intelligence about their numbers, their habits, and their weaknesses. They mocked him as a worthless beggar, threw food at him, and threatened him with violence, never suspecting that they were tormenting the very man whose wealth they were consuming and whose wife they hoped to claim. The greatest test came when he encountered Penelope herself, who had agreed to meet with the mysterious beggar in hopes that he might have news of her missing husband. The meeting was heart-wrenching for both of them. She sat so close, he could have reached out and touched her, yet he dared not reveal his identity until the time was right. Instead, he spun an elaborate tale about meeting Odysseus in distant lands, offering just enough hope to sustain her spirits while maintaining his crucial disguise. Penelope's own story, as it emerged through their conversation, was one of extraordinary courage and cleverness. For years she had held off the suitors through a series of ingenious delays, most famously by claiming that she must first finish weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law Laertes. Each day she would work at the loom, making visible progress on the elaborate garment. But each night she would secretly unravel what she had woven, ensuring that the task could never be completed. The deception had worked for 3 years, until one of her faithless serving women betrayed the secret to the suitors. Forced to complete the shroud, Penelope had been compelled to seek new strategies for delay. But her resistance was weakening, and the pressure to choose a new husband was becoming irresistible. It was only her absolute faith in Odysseus's eventual return that had kept her from yielding to despair. The moment of reckoning came when Penelope, inspired perhaps by divine insight, announced that she would finally choose a new husband through a contest of skill. She brought forth Odysseus's great bow, the weapon that had been his most prized possession, and declared that whoever could string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe handles set in a row would win her hand in marriage. The contest was perfectly designed, though Penelope may not have fully realized it herself. The bow had been a gift from a god, crafted with divine skill and requiring not just enormous strength, but also the specific knowledge of its proper handling. Odysseus was the only man alive who possessed both the physical capability and the technical understanding needed to use the weapon effectively. One by one, the suitors attempted to string the mighty bow, and one by one, they failed. The strongest among them could not even bend the weapon, while others succeeded in pulling the string part way, but lacked the technique to complete the process. Their failure was not just physical but symbolic. They were proving themselves unworthy of the throne they sought to claim, and the woman they hoped to marry. As the night deepens around you and sleep claims your thoughts, picture the moment when the disguised Odysseus stepped forward and asked permission to try the bow. The suitors' reaction was explosive. They raged at the idea that a mere beggar should attempt what their strength had failed to accomplish. But Penelope, with queenly authority, insisted that the stranger be given his chance, declaring that even a successful beggar could not claim her hand, since he was not one of her noble suitors. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in all literature. Odysseus took the bow in his hands and, with the ease of long familiarity, strung it in a single fluid motion that made the task appear effortless. The weapon sang as the string snapped into place, its voice carrying across the hall like a note of divine music. Without hesitation, he notched an arrow and sent it flying straight through all 12 axe handles, accomplishing what had seemed impossible. But the archery contest was only the beginning of Odysseus's revelation. As the suitors sat stunned by what they had witnessed, he threw off his beggar's rags and stood revealed in his true form, no longer the aged wanderer, but the king of Ithaca in all his terrible majesty. His second arrow found the throat of Antinous, the leader of the suitors, who died with a cup of wine still at his lips. The slaughter that followed was swift and merciless. Odysseus and Telemachus, aided by the faithful swineherd Eumaeus and the cowherd Philoetius, systematically hunted down every one of the suitors who had violated the sacred laws of hospitality. The great hall that had been the scene of their revelry became their tomb, and when the work was done, justice had been served in full measure. The reunion between Odysseus and Penelope was the emotional climax of the entire epic. Even after witnessing her husband's triumph, Penelope remained cautious, testing him to ensure that this was truly the man she had married 20 years before. Only when he demonstrated his knowledge of their marriage bed, carved from a living olive tree that still grew within their bedroom, did she finally accept that her vigil was over and her beloved had truly returned. Their love scene was described with delicate beauty, emphasizing not passion, but the deep satisfaction of two souls finally reunited after decades of separation. They spent the night, not just in physical reunion, but in sharing the stories of their long ordeal. He telling of his wanderings and adventures, she recounting her struggles to maintain their kingdom and preserve their marriage against impossible odds. The final movement of Odysseus's story dealt with the restoration of proper order to Ithaca and the reconciliation with those he had wronged. His reunion with his aged father Laertes was deeply moving, the old man barely able to believe that his son had truly returned from what had seemed certain death. The meeting took place in the orchard where Laertes had withdrawn in his grief, and it was there that the circle of family was finally made complete again. But Odysseus's trials were not quite finished, for the families of the slain suitors demanded vengeance for their sons' deaths. Armed conflict seemed inevitable until Athena herself intervened, appearing in her true form to command peace between the factions. The goddess's intervention represented more than divine authority. It symbolized the triumph of justice and order over chaos and unlawful ambition. The epic's conclusion brought Odysseus full circle from the war at Troy to the peace of his restored kingdom. He had gained something more precious than all the treasure he had lost: wisdom earned through suffering, humility learned through hardship, and an understanding of what truly mattered in human life. The man who returned to Ithaca was both the same hero who had left 20 years before and someone fundamentally transformed by his long journey through trials that had tested every aspect of his character. As you rest in the gentle embrace of sleep, let the final images of this ancient tale carry you toward peaceful dreams. Picture Odysseus in his restored palace, surrounded by his family and faithful servants, ruling once again over the kingdom he had thought lost forever. But the prophecy of Tiresias remained to be fulfilled. One final journey awaited him, an inland voyage to appease Poseidon's wrath completely and ensure the peace of his final years. The image of that future journey, carrying an oar to people who had never seen the sea, making sacrifice in a distant land to the god who had opposed him so long, represented the ongoing nature of human struggle and the complex relationships between mortals and the divine forces that shaped their lives. Even heroes must sometimes humble themselves before powers greater than their own, and true wisdom lay in understanding when to fight and when to yield. The legacy of Odysseus's journey extended far beyond his personal homecoming. His Odyssey became the archetypal story of human perseverance, of the refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. Every wanderer who ever sought home, every person who ever struggled against overwhelming odds, every soul who ever maintained faith in ultimate justice could find something of themselves in the tale of the King of Ithaca. The epic's themes resonated across the centuries because they touched on experiences universal to human existence. The longing for home, the bonds of family, the testing of character through adversity, the complex dance between fate and free will that shapes every human life. Odysseus's story became not just entertainment, but a template for understanding how nobility could emerge from suffering and how wisdom could be earned through trial. In the end, the wine-dark sea that had been the stage for so much struggle became a symbol of life itself. Vast, unpredictable, sometimes hostile, but ultimately navigable by those who possessed the courage, intelligence, and determination to chart their course through its mysteries. The hero's return to Ithaca represented not just the end of one man's journey, but the eternal human triumph of home over homelessness, order over chaos, love over hatred. As the ancient tale draws to its close and the final saga reaches its peaceful end, the figure of Odysseus stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit, to endure, to learn, and to triumph over circumstances that would defeat a lesser soul. His Odyssey reminds us that the true voyage is not just the physical journey across trackless seas, but the spiritual passage from ignorance to wisdom, from pride to humility, from isolation to understanding. The king of Ithaca found his way home at last, not just to a place, but to an understanding of what home truly meant, not merely a location on a map, but a state of being where love, loyalty, and justice could flourish under the protection of those strong enough and wise enough to defend them. In reaching that destination, Odysseus completed not just his own personal odyssey, but showed the way for all who would follow after, seeking their own paths across the wine-dark sea of human experience toward whatever distant shore called to them with the voice of hope and the promise of home.